Hey now, NecroVMX here with another review of an off-the-beaten-path RPG for the SNES, or in this case, for the Super Famicom. It's been quite a while since the last one, which dropped last October, and here we are in January, but, well, I gotta play the games to review them. And since this project to play as many SNES and Super Famicom RPGs as I can exists for a few hours every Thursday night on Twitch, well, some longer games take a while to get through. So last time I covered Paladin's Quest, or as it was known in Japan, Lennus Memories of an Ancient Machine, and today I'll be covering its Japan-exclusive sequel, Lennus 2 The Apostles of the Seals, which I played on the Hygan emulator. While the first game was mostly overlooked in the United States due to its horribly misleading localized title, this game was actually overlooked even in Japan due to the fact that it was horribly delayed by a few years, with the director describing the project as cursed, and it took 4 years to make instead of the initially projected 2. This led to it being released in 1996 at the very end of the Super Famicom's lifespan, sadly 1 month after the release of the Nintendo 64, and of course the PlayStation had already been out for quite some time. Due to this, plans for a third game were put on hold indefinitely, and considering that I found out that the creator of this series passed away in 2018, I don't think it's ever going to happen. But I did play this game via a fan translation by Magic Destiny, who are now known as Dynamic Designs. And Lennus 2, having played it directly after the original, is a game that felt at times very familiar and almost comforting, but also at times drastically different from the original. So let's get down to it. I'll be rating Lennus 2 The Apostles of the Seals on a scale from 1 to 10 in the following categories: graphics and presentation, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and balance and difficulty. And as I always do, I remind you all that on a 10-point scale, 5 is average, not terrible. I remind you that on a 10-point scale, 7 is good, not average. I really shouldn't have to say this every time, but I don't know, I get this feeling that the one time that I don't is the one time that it will become an issue, so, I gotta do what I gotta do. So, starting out with graphics and presentation. This game is initially striking for two opposing reasons. One is that the game's look and amount of detail is obviously a great deal more advanced than its predecessor, which sacrificed detail for a unique look. Lennus 2, by comparison, is very detailed and features a lot more animation in general, looking a lot more 16-bit than its predecessor. On the other hand, the game also looks a lot like other games and has a lot less to stand out. I mean, there's a lot more colors, but they seem muted and not as bright. The landscapes are still very alien-looking, but a bit more analogous to Earth. The entire thing is just less unique in general. So while Lennus 2 boasts a lot more detail, it doesn't look as unique. This is something that I felt became more noticeable as I progressed further in the game. Enemy design is still extremely wacky and great, though I noticed that there seems to be less wacky-looking NPCs this time around. Another big change is the main character, Faris, has a different, smaller sprite on the overworld and a more detailed sprite in towns and dungeons. I think I like this change. It makes the overworld seem bigger, like you're zoomed out or something. There are some rather striking visuals, such as the highly detailed look at your party before each battle. Some of the cutscenes are rather beautiful, and I mentioned before, enemy design is just great. I just wish that Lennus 2 had retained the brighter, bolder colors of its predecessor. The presentation sort of doubles down from the first game. Paladin's Quest had introduced a directional-based input design for the in-battle menus, and I thought that was rather innovative and fun. Now this menu style is there for all the menus, which means that the game can almost be entirely played with the D-pad. You only ever really need to press a button to open the menu or to cancel something. The look of these menus isn't entirely aesthetically pleasing, but they are extremely functional. Overall, Lennus 2 is a fairly attractive game, though I wish it had more bold colors in it. Comparing it to other RPGs that came out in 1996 would mean that I would give it very unfavorable comparisons to games like Super Mario RPG or Bahamut Lagoon or Treasure of the Rudras, though I have to consider the long delay. It was probably supposed to come out in 1994. That would place it more with games like Final Fantasy VI or Breath of Fire 2, and I think Lennus 2 looks as good, or maybe even a little bit better than, say, Breath of Fire 2. So when trying to decide whether I think that it looks better than its predecessor, I have to say that yeah, it does on a technical level, and occasionally on an artistic level as well. It's just my personal thing that I wish they had leaned more into the weirdness and bold colors. For graphics and presentation, I give Lennus 2 an 8. For music and sound effects, Lennus 2 addresses my main complaint from the first game, which was not that there weren't good songs, there just weren't enough songs. There are over double the amount of songs this time. The first game had 31 tracks, this one has 71 tracks. This is a huge improvement, and some of the iconic songs from the first games do make appearances here as well. I really like the music in this game. It helped punctuate the dark parts of the story as well as underlining the sillier parts of the story. Ironically, most of the songs that I liked the best came from the first game, but that's not a knock against this game. These songs exist in this game as well, and they actually sound a little bit better. The sound effects are fine. They were actually a standout in Paladin's Quest, but here they just, sort of function. Overall, this is a great sounding game with a lot of variety, though not as many tracks stood out to me. For music and sound effects, I give Lennus 2 an 8. For story and writing, well, there's a lot to unpack here. This time you play as a Raigan warrior and spiritualist named Faris, who has been asleep for a long time. He is awakened in the mysterious world of Andal and told to work on something called the Great Union. After a few dungeons and quests, he accomplishes this. However, the results of this are smashing together the floating continents of Andal into one mass, causing a lot of casualties. And the result shows that you've been under the planet's surface. You reach the surface of the planet that's called Eltz, which is in an opposing orbit to Lennus, which is where the first game took place. You're told that the true Great Union will be to unite the two planets into one, which honestly makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, Lennus had all the land masses on the left side of the map, with the right side being almost entirely ocean, and Eltz is the opposite of that. All the land masses are on the right side, and the left side is almost entirely ocean. However, due to how badly the first Great Union went, you're trying to prevent this from happening. Your guide in this is a mysterious bald man called Petro, who had been trying to contact you throughout the entire first part of the game, and the main villain is actually your own father, Granada, who wishes to merge not only the two planets into one, but also merge them with the planet that they orbit, Raiga, destroying all three and creating a new star. Why does he want to do this? Well, because he's evil, I guess. They don't go into that too much. The story is pretty good here. There's as much a sense of urgency in stopping the final Great Union as there is in stopping Neugren in the first game. And of course, you'll get to travel to Lennus and see all the familiar sights from the first game, including some familiar characters. For the most part, the story works, except when it gets a little bit bogged down. On 2 separate occasions, you have to retrieve the 8 seals, which feels a little bit repetitive to me, and there's a gigantic chunk of the game that takes place in a single city and the surrounding area. The city, of course, is just gigantic. It's the largest city that I've ever seen in an RPG, and that's quite honestly very impressive. It felt long enough to be a game within itself. The writing here is very good, and I really have to hand it to the translation team. However, there's a lot, and I do mean a lot of adult humor here, and I don't mean mature humor, I mean the kind of thing that a teenager thinks is adult humor. Apparently Faris must be the most attractive man in the universe, and every woman throws himself at him. It's honestly only funny like the first 2 times or so. An odd quirk is that Faris starts out as a silent protagonist, but then he starts talking a little bit when he gets from Andal to Eltz. By the time you're on Lennus, he's making long speeches. Now, I don't mind the character talking, I just wish they had worked more on establishing his character and his personality earlier on. Maybe then I would understand why women were throwing themselves at him. Since the game's script was done by fan translators, we don't run into a lot of the clipped speaking that we did in the first game, and none of the weird abbreviations. It's well written, it's just that there's parts that are just kind of cringeworthy. Almost every bit of humor is either juvenile sex humor or the likes of jokes about spousal abuse, which really aren't funny. And this time, I can't blame the translators. The juvenile sex jokes might have definitely been added by the translators, at least some of them, especially since the game's tutorial had them breaking the fourth wall and talking about emulation and save states. Yeah, thanks for that, but yeah, the animations shown in-game definitely confirmed that the spousal abuse jokes must have been there in Japanese as well. There's also some weird moments, like when I found an enemy called a jizz burner. yeah. And after my Japanese friend dug out her copy and loaded up a save that was near where I was, she confirmed that it was the name in Japanese as well. Wow, so yeah, there's some warts here, and I think that that's a shame, since otherwise the story and writing would have been a big leap over the original. But in this case, both the fact that Lennus 2 is a bit too long for its own good and tries too hard to be edgy for its own good, I gotta give it a 7 out of 10 for story and writing. Onwards to gameplay and controls. If you played the first game, this is all very familiar, so I'll mostly be talking about differences here. Now, I'm sorry if you're looking for more of a standalone review, but if you want more detail on the game's systems and whatnot, maybe you should just watch my review of Paladin's Quest, since most of the information there is still relevant. So anyway, the game's magic system is the same as the first game, meaning that there's no magic points, you cast spells from your health. Though I noticed, this time around, you're able to cast a lot more spells. They don't seem as detrimental to your health. There are 8 spirits this time, and you get 1 spell for each spirit and 1 for each combination of 2 spirits, though the amount of spirits that Faris can equip starts at 1 and maxes out at 4, so you have to change them up based on your situation. Battles pretty much work the same. There's 2 big differences to how you progress, though. The good news is that you no longer have to use a spell to level up its spirit, so you don't need to spam a spell to make it stronger. Instead, enemies drop spirit level ups for you, and the type of spirits that you get from enemies is shown visually with very easy to understand icons. The bad news is that enemies rarely drop a significant amount of money. The amount of grinding that you would have to do to afford new equipment in this game is absolutely insane. You absolutely have to rely on finding and selling things to get money, which means that you'll never have the best equipment in an area before going into a dungeon, but only after you've raided the dungeon. The mercenary system is back, and since there isn't an equivalent to Midia from the first game, you can now have 3 mercenaries instead of 2. And it's all mostly the same. You find them in taverns, you hire them, and you hope they're good. The big difference here is that you can now change your mercenaries' equipment. Though you can't change their spirits, you can level their spirits up. So you'd think being able to swap equipment on a mercenary is a good thing, but not so much. I have 2 issues with this. For one, it's just more shit to buy. And even with raiding dungeons for things to sell, you'll come up short. You'll be able to afford the best equipment for 4 characters? Never. Not until maybe the very end of the game when money becomes trivial, though at that point the stuff that you find is a lot better than the stuff you can buy. My other issue is that it kind of makes swapping an old mercenary for a new one a lot less enticing. In the first game you could level them up, but once their equipment started becoming outdated, you probably needed to make a change. In this case, you could find yourself with a mercenary offering you services that has higher stats than the one you have, but after you've invested so much time and money into their equipment, it's annoying to just kick them out. You can strip your mercenaries of their equipment when they leave, however this means that if you change your mind and you want them back, and you've sold their old stuff, you're back at square one. One of the most fun aspects of Paladin's Quest was constantly upgrading to new mercenaries, but in this case I always felt like it was a pain. I also noted that towards the end of the game, it's actually difficult to find enemies that drop decent experience points. There was a dungeon that was not quite at the end that gave way better experience rewards than the rest of the game, including the final dungeon. Unless you pay attention to numbers, you may find yourself spending an insane amount of time trying to gain a level. Overall, there are some improvements made, especially with the magic, but the amount of micromanaging that you need to do is a lot bigger. I have to say that gameplay-wise, I absolutely prefer the first game, even though this one's approach to magic leveling up is a lot better. For gameplay and controls, I give Lennus 2 a 6. For balance and difficulty, Lennus 2 is kind of all over the map. For the most part, it skews easier than most RPGs, until it doesn't. There are several difficulty spikes that will force you to step back and re-examine your strategies, particularly Faris's loadout of spirits, or perhaps which mercenaries you've brought, since grinding for levels isn't an option most of the time due to very slow experience growth. For the most part, changing up your strats will work most of the time, or swapping around equipment. The biggest issue is that some mercenaries are locked behind side quests that you'll have to do, and you never know if it's going to be worth it. For example, there's one mercenary in the grand city of Nigel that forces you to buy her very specific equipment before she'll join you, something that I passed on doing I thought it was a pain in the ass, and that's especially how hard money is to come by. At this point, I was still trying to get Faris's equipment upgraded. It turns out that she's one of the best physically oriented characters in the game. Oh well. By the time I found this out, it would have been trivial to go back and get her, but she would have been half the level of the rest of the party. So you wind up being kind of stuck with some of the poorer decisions that you may end up making, or having to spend a lot of time undoing them. It's not an overly hard game, it's also not an overly balanced game, since it can go from cakewalk to hard in seconds flat, but overall I never found myself overly frustrated with Lennus 2. It definitely overall skews easier than the first game, despite this game going out of its way to make you not grind for levels. And hey, this time the last boss is a lot better balanced, since you don't need one specific plot-relevant spell to do any kind of damage to him, and that only one party member can cast it. That was kind of annoying, so that's good that they took that out. For balance and difficulty, I give Lennus 2 a 7. So, tallying it all up, the final score for Lennus 2, The Apostles of the Seals, is a pretty good score of 7.2. It's slightly lower score than its predecessor got, which honestly, it's a very respectable score, but it's almost kind of a letdown for me on a personal level, since it's a sequel and you really want all aspects of the sequel to improve upon the original. But in this case, some things improved, other things didn't. And it's kind of hard to look at Lennus 2 in a vacuum, since so much of its plot calls back to the first game. Overall, if you loved Paladin's Quest, don't let my mild criticisms of its sequel turn you off. As if you're listening to me now, you probably likely are in the market for another SNES RPG that you maybe haven't tried, and Lennus 2 is worth trying, with my only caveat being that if you haven't, you really should play the first game prior to it.